Hello and welcome to Indus News. Now, several people have been injured after a stabbing at London Bridge in the centre of the British capital. Police shot and injured the suspect after taking him into custody. The bridge has been closed for traffic after the attack. London Bridge was hit by a terror attack in 2017 which killed 8 people. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says Britain will leave the European Union by January 31st if he wins the December 12th elections. Johnson said he sees no reason to extend the transition period beyond the end of 2020 and said US President Donald Trump should avoid getting involved in Britain's election during the London visit for NATO summit next week. In October, Trump said Labour's Jeremy Corbyn would be bad for Britain and Johnson should form a coalition with British party leader Nigel Farage. Polls released today show Johnson is on track to win the upcoming elections by a wide margin. Israeli forces shoot dead 1 Palestinian and wound 4 others during a protest along the Gaza border. They were protesting against the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Health Ministry says another Palestinian died of wounds he sustained in an Israeli airstrike on the 13th of November. Israeli forces have killed over 300 Palestinians and wounded about 18,000 others since March last year. In Iraq, Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi says he will offer his resignation to Parliament following weeks of violent protests that left over 400 people dead. But he did not specify when he would hand in his resignation. The decision follows Iraq's top cleric Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani's call for a change of leadership. This comes a day after 50 people were killed by security forces in one of the bloodiest days of violence since the protests began last month. The protests were sparked by widespread anger and corruption and unemployment. Yemen's Houthi rebels claim they shot down a Saudi helicopter near Asr in Saudi Arabia's border zone. A Houthi forces spokesperson, Brigadier General Yahya Sari, said 2 soldiers in the aircraft were killed. Sari said the helicopter was shot down this morning by a surface-to-air missile. Saudi Arabia has not yet commented on the incident. The claim comes a day after Riyadh released 128 Houthi rebels from prison. Well, staying with Yemen, 10 people have been killed in an attack in Sada province. The UN humanitarian coordinator for Yemen said 22 others were wounded in an attack on a market. Lisa Grande said 4 children and a woman were among the victims on the attack on the Al Raku market. She said many of the victims are Ethiopian migrants. No one has yet claimed responsibility for the attack. Now, in our other top story, the Taliban say it's too early to speak of resuming direct talks with the United States. And that's a day after President Donald Trump made his first ever visit to Afghanistan. The statement follows Trump's remarks that the peace talks with the Taliban have started up again and that the group wants to make a deal to end the war in Afghanistan. Trump said Washington is substantially reducing the number of US troops deployed in the country. In September, Trump abruptly called off talks with the Taliban after the killing of a US soldier in a Taliban attack. However, a prisoner swap between the Afghan government and the Taliban earlier this month raised hopes for the resumption of the peace process. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Intezar Khadim, who's an analyst based in Kabul. Intezar, thank you for joining us on Indus News. So, Mr. Trump has expressed optimism that the Taliban will agree to a ceasefire, but do you really think they will?
Donald Trump came to Kabul and he was speaking to media with mixed messages. From one side, he was telling stories of the colossus economic and political power of America to the world. After that, he was trying to tell the Taliban leadership that Americans have flexibility to talk to you again and resume that. As the Ruhollah Mujahid, the spokesperson of Taliban, asserted that the talk would resume from where it stopped and stalled, I think I'm feeling the same way, but with addition that there could be a revision both from the Taliban side and from the American side. Because for the first round, there has been a simple trust, mutual trust between American and Taliban, but there has been slips and a little bit deviation from the promises they made toward each other. This time there could be an addition of two-side promises which would be guaranteed by guarantors in the region, in the world. So I think that was a surprise visit, and that will have a specific impact on the security issues, election and peace in Afghanistan as well.
Look, the US has said the violence has to stop, and that's obvious if you want to have peace in Afghanistan. But President Ashraf saying the same thing. Do you think the Taliban will now agree with both President Ashraf Ghani and US President Donald Trump?
Well, I think there should be a reduction in two sectors. There should be reduction in the violences from the Taliban side, and there should be reduction in the forces of Americans existed in Afghanistan. I think that's interconnected issues. Taliban would be promising in ensuring that there should be a de-escalation of violences from Taliban, including the bomb blast and suicide attacks, and there could be a reduction in attacks and counterattacks between Taliban, the American forces, and the Afghan government. But at the same time, Taliban would like to assure themselves that if you would like to step back, you have to step back as well. I mean, the Americans should be following the tree balance or the tree sheet of the mutual promises made by two sides. But Taliban leadership understand that if they announce a ceasefire and they order the Taliban or foot soldiers in the ground who are fighting for the purpose of Taliban leadership, then that will be the weakness position of Taliban. So they would like to announce a ceasefire when they ensure that the American side will be following their promises as well.
Intezar Khadim, thank you for joining us on Indus News. Now, staying with Afghanistan, and hundreds of protesters have marched to the presidential palace in Kabul, and that's to protest against alleged electoral fraud. Abdullah Abdullah's election team has called for protests, accusing President Ashraf Ghani of meddling with election results. Demonstrators chanted anti-fraud slogans calling for the exclusion of votes from the recounting process. They said the process should be stopped until the votes are removed from the count. The government closed routes to downtown Kabul to try to stop the protesters. The presidential election was held in September, but results have still not yet been announced. Now, the OIC has called for a probe into human rights violations in Indian-occupied Kashmir. In a meeting in Jeddah, the body called India's move to strip Kashmir of its autonomy illegal and void. It condemned arrests and the killings of Kashmiris. The OIC said it will conduct an independent study on the use of pellet guns by Indian troops. The OIC also urged the international community to stop India's human rights violations in the valley. Kashmir has been under a lockdown and communications blackout since the 5th of August. Well, as the dispute over gas between Russia and Ukraine continues, Russia says the country is blackmailing the international community by threatening to pull out of the Donbass agreement. Earlier, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Vadim Prystyako raised the possibility of Kiev's withdrawal from the Minsk agreement. Russia's envoy in Europe, Alexander Lukashevich, has warned the bloc against Ukraine's intentions. Lukashevich said a Ukrainian withdrawal from the Minsk process will restart bloodshed in Donbass. He said the fate of the Minsk agreement depends on the Normandy Force summit, scheduled this December 9th. A United Nations senior official has expressed alarm and worry over Europe's lack of support for unaccompanied migrant children. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, said Greece is overburdened, hosting thousands of migrants. Grandi said Europe must come up with a policy to ease the crisis.
Europe has to get its act together on these issues anyway. You know, the Dublin principles that everybody has to go and seek asylum in the first country in Europe in which they enter was perhaps okay 20 years ago when there were few people, but is completely inadequate now. So Europe has to have a new system that is based more on sharing, on responsibility sharing.
In Geneva, the Syrian government and the opposition have failed to agree on an agenda for the constitutional talks to end 8.5 years of war in Syria. The UN Special Envoy to Syria, Geir Pedersen, says the talks ended without a meeting of 45 delegates meant to be negotiating on the constitution. The talks are being seen as a step forward towards a political settlement in the country. But experts question whether President Bashar al-Assad will be willing to grant concessions after recapturing large parts of the area in offensives against rebels and militants since the last 5 years. Syria has been embroiled in a multi-sided civil war since 2011, and according to the United Nations, the violence has killed over 600,000 people. Now, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan slams French leader Emmanuel Macron over his recent criticisms of NATO. Erdogan was speaking in Istanbul and said the French president, who is suffering brain death, he was referring to Macron's remarks that NATO is dying due to a lack of cooperation among members. Responding to Macron's criticism of Ankara's military operation in Syria, Erdogan said some countries can't accept Turkey's efforts to protect its sovereignty.
Macron says NATO is experiencing a brain death. I'm addressing Mr. Macron from Turkey, and I will say it at NATO. You should check whether you are brain dead first.
Or staying with NATO, and it's celebrating 70 years since it was established in 1949. NATO was first created as a means of defense against the Soviet Union. The 26-nation alliance aims to enhance stability through a system of collective security. Though the alliance now has 26 members, it started with just 12. Major NATO members include countries such as the US, the UK, Germany, France and Belgium. Now, closer to home, Pakistan and China will conduct a joint maritime exercise in the Arabian Sea in January. China's Ministry of National Defense says the drill will be held under the annual military exchange plan between the two countries. Speaking in Beijing, spokesman Ren Guoqiang said the exercise doesn't target any third party. He said the drill aims to strengthen security cooperation between Pakistan and China. Now, Hong Kong police say they found 4,000 petrol bombs during the cleanup operation at the Polytechnic University. Police say more than 1,300 explosive items and over 600 bottles of acid were also found. The campus has now been returned to the university after the cleanup operation. It was the site of an 11-day-long standoff between activists and police that ended on Wednesday. Police made more than 1,300 arrests during the siege, while more demonstrations were held earlier today. Now, Sudan's Transitional Council has approved a law to dismantle the regime of former President Omar al-Bashir. The order also included the dissolution of al-Bashir's political party and the confiscation of all of its properties. Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok said the law was not an act of revenge. He said it's meant to preserve the dignity of the Sudanese people. The legislation was passed during a joint meeting of Sudan's Sovereign Council and Cabinet. The body also scrapped a law regulating women's dress and behavior. The Sudanese Professionals Association said it was an important step on the path to a democratic state. Now to South America, where Chile's government has held its first dialogue with protesters to resolve the country's month-old social unrest. Meanwhile, the central bank has announced a $20 billion injection into the economy to support the Chilean peso. The protesters want a 50% increase in the minimum wage and the replacement of the Pinochet-era private pension scheme. Chile's social unrest has hit the production of copper, which is its most lucrative industry. Protesters outside the presidential palace called for President Sebastián Piñera to take responsibility for police brutality in the demonstrations.
Started shooting and one of those pellets hit me in the eye. Due to bad luck, I lost my right eye. My eye was taken out and now I am waiting to receive a prosthesis in order to return to a normal life.
Amnesty International says female human rights activists are frequently threatened and attacked for promoting gender equality. In a report marking International Women Human Rights Day, it said activists are even killed for their campaigning. Kumi Naidu, Amnesty International Secretary General, said women who face discrimination have to fight harder. The report said politicians, religious leaders and violent groups spreading hate speech pose the worst threat to female activists. Now, the Friday for Future movement has kicked off demonstrations around the world against climate change. Protesters have rallied in the streets of Sydney, picketing the headquarters of Australia's ruling party. The protesters held placards reading "You're burning our future" and chanted "We will rise." Australia has been devastated by hundreds of raging bushfires over recent weeks in what some are calling a climate emergency. 6 people have died and hundreds of homes have been destroyed in the fires. Climate activists have also come out in Melbourne and Tokyo to raise awareness. And more protests are scheduled for today in Paris, Madrid, Berlin and Marseille. The Tokyo Electric Power Company says radioactive water may be leaking from an exhaust stack at the Fukushima power plant. The company says rainwater leaving the ducts of the stack contained high levels of radioactive material. Earlier this month, Tokyo said it would be safe to release radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean, drawing strong criticism. After the tsunami and nuclear meltdown in March 8 years ago, the company installed a concrete exhaust stack to contain radioactive water. But that stack has collected water that's already exceeded 100 tons, and storage space is expected to be filled up by summer next year. Now, in other news, in Poland, a drone-making company called Spartax has just shown off its latest design. It's called the Hermes, and it's built to carry medical cargo to hospitals and emergency zones. More in this report.
The skies are crowded with competition by drone makers. The very latest is Hermes, a drone-like vehicle that can fly without the aid of a human pilot. It is making a successful 8.5-kilometer test flight near the Spartax headquarters in the town of Mykolo. It will soon be making journeys between a blood bank and the Institute of Cardiology in Warsaw.
This version here is made for medical transportation. It may transport medical samples, blood, and other cargoes related to the medical and pharmaceutical industry. This drone is equipped with a special medical container, which is fixed here, but this part of the drone may be replaced by a different one.
Hermes is the company's most advanced project, but a tour of the premises reveals other prototypes that appear to have emerged straight out of science fiction.
These are usually products made for a specific customer. I can reveal that we are now preparing special drones for working in the mines. They enter underground galleries, they are specially built for that purpose, and are made to detect threats going into places too dangerous for people. We will be working on this project for a big Polish company.
Aside from these, the company has an anti-drone model able to destroy the battery of an enemy drone. Building reconnaissance drones for the army or border guards makes up a large percentage of Spartax models.
In Nigeria, an African NGO is working to literally put Lagos' floating slums on the map. Using geolocation technology, the group's volunteers are navigating the slums' waterways to make a map they hope will improve the lives of the people living there. More in this report.
Welcome to Makoko, a floating slum in the Nigerian megacity of Lagos. Officially, this part of the city does not exist. You won't find these dingy canals and ramshackle huts indicated on any city maps. But John and his team are trying to change that. Armed with their location tracking smartphones, they crisscross these waterways with the aim of putting Makoko and its approximately 300,000 inhabitants on the map.
We can have multi-layers of points of interest on this map. So we can see the streets and have easy navigation, and all of this can be on the map for free.
John works for South Africa-based NGO Code for Africa, the organisation behind this drive to map out the slum and improve the lives of those who live here. Every point of interest is carefully entered into the system, like Watanabo, a floating barber shop.
So we're putting your barbing salon on the map. Yeah, to be part of the points of interest that people will see. When they look at Makoko map, they will see Watanabo.
John believes that the inhabitants of this part of the city should have access to the same knowledge of their neighbourhood enjoyed by those who live elsewhere in Lagos. The public will now be able to see this neighbourhood differently, as the map is ready to go online.
A Sowetan-born South African chef is taking the culinary world by storm. In his restaurant, he serves dishes inspired by Thai, Moroccan and Mexican cooking. The gastronome wants to make high-end cuisine accessible to all and educate people on eating fresh, well-cooked food. More in this report.
Meet Wandile Mabaso, chef and owner of Le Creatives restaurant that has created a stir in the South African city of Johannesburg. Driven and classically trained by the world's greatest chefs, Mabaso is determined to do things his way. His restaurant serves a high-end fusion of contemporary French South African cuisine.
I don't write recipes, I don't cook by recipe. I just get inspiration from nature, things around me, current situations, climate, the weather.
Mabaso uses familiar South African ingredients such as maize flour, the popular spicy relish chakalaka, and even rooibos tea in some cocktails. He says he wants his guests to enjoy the memories of their township through the food.
What I love most about the food is that it's unexpected. Every night it's different, and the food is fresh. It's fresh produce.
And so I love the passion, I love the ambition behind this place.
With elements of unpredictability and surprise, Mabaso hopes his cuisine can inspire the next generation of chefs.
Welcome back. Now in business news, US stocks are trading lower due to the ongoing trade tensions between the US and China. The tensions have risen after Beijing rebuked President Trump's decision to back protesters in Hong Kong. All three major Wall Street indices have shed about 0.25%, while European stock markets traded mixed. Frankfurt's DAX and the CAC 40 in Paris gained fractionally, while London's FTSE shed about 0.5%. India's economy grew at its slowest pace in more than 6 years in the July-September period. Data released by the government shows the economic growth is down 4.5% from 7% a year ago. This marked the 6th consecutive quarterly contraction in Asia's third largest economy. Consumer demand has shrunk and unemployment increased to a 4-decade high. Experts are predicting a further slowdown of the economy due to an ongoing financial crisis. Well, it's 16 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore, but don't forget, for the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Thank you for watching and bye-bye.